Hello, everyone. Good evening. Today is August 23rd, 2020. We are happy to be welcoming Nadia Moshtagh Razi to give us a talk about the Baha'i Faith and racism in the US. I will be reading her CV in just a minute to introduce Nadia. And meanwhile, people will be streaming in. So if if I do see that there are too many people coming in, we will pause just for a few more minutes and then start after more people have come in. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. The title of today's conversation and discussion is The History of Systemic Racism in the United States and the Baha'i Approach to Racial Justice. Nadia Moshtagh Razi teaches African American literature and AVID at Foothill High School in Pleasanton, California. She served as the English department chair, is a SEED educational equity and diversity leader, and is a Google certified educator. She has led initiatives throughout her district promoting equitable practices for the students of color and LGBTQ+ students, spearheaded policy change for transgender and non-binary students throughout the district, and advised the BSU and GSA student clubs. She is a Teach Plus California Senior Policy Fellow, publishing research and legislation on culturally affirming school environments and teacher diversity. She is also a consultant with LEAD, Leadership in Equity and Academic Achievement. She earned a BA in English Literature and an MED in Teaching and Learning from the University of California in San Diego. So without anything further from my side, I would like to welcome Nadia. And just to let everybody know, at the end of the talk, we will be welcoming questions from everyone. If in the middle of the talk at any time you'd like to start typing in your messages, I will look through them and we'll be asking Nadia whatever questions you put forward for me, and then we will be speaking about them at the end. So please feel free to start putting your questions and your thoughts together so that we can talk at the end, okay? Thank you so much. Nadia, come on in.
Thank you so much for having me. I just realized right now that I have a sound on whenever someone joins, so I hope that that's not too annoying. I was trying to figure out how to turn it off, but whatever. So thank you so much for having me. I'm grateful for this opportunity to discuss such a vital and timely topic. A couple things before we get started. When I share my screen, I'll be presenting a hyperdoc, which is a tool that I use a lot in my teaching, and that I hope that you will be able to take back to your own study groups to continue this important discussion. That being said, you will see a lot of text, which is something that I always tell my students not to do when they're presenting, but I encourage you to go back and take your time to read through, reflect on, and discuss all the information. I won't get to everything today, so please know that if you want to learn more about a topic, there is a wealth of resources linked in the hyperdoc. So right now, can you all see my screen? Just making sure. Someone give me a verbal yes. In my years teaching African American literature, I've understood more about the history of racism in the United States than I have in any of my schooling throughout my life. I have compiled a timeline, which is linked on the main page of the hyperdoc, that represents what I've learned. I understand that as a resident of the East San Francisco Bay Area, I live on land that was stolen from the Chochenyo Ohlone people. And I know that Africans were kidnapped and enslaved in a system that was first to designate race as justification for enslavement. I understand that Black women, like the first woman to be blamed and accused in the Salem witch trials, have been written out of history, and that our country forced 120,000 Japanese American people into internment camps during World War II. Most importantly, I understand that to this day, racism has been written into laws that disproportionately affect Black Americans every day. And without that knowledge, I would not have a clear picture of why and how we find ourselves in the midst of the largest racial justice movement in over 50 years. In 2020, the United States and the world recognize that racism goes beyond derogatory words and discriminatory actions. Racism has actually been embedded into our national systems, rewarding white people and systematically disadvantaging non-white people since 1492. So there is so much that has been hidden, especially in the mainstream media, especially in the mistreatment of several racial and ethnic groups. Native and Indigenous peoples, Black and African American people, Asians and Pacific Islanders, and Mexican and Chicane people. Additionally, this timeline includes oppression of anyone perceived to be an other in our society, including communists, LGBTQ+ people, and most recently, Muslims. Since I decided to take responsibility and to do my own research, I now understand that there is crucial unlearning for every American to do in order to understand race relations in our country. When we read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in my African American literature class, students have made comments like, wow, I knew slavery was bad, but I didn't realize it was this bad. And why didn't we learn this in history class? Some have mentioned that they've never even read a book by a Black author until they get to my class. And even though the required books for grades 9 and 10 in my school district include the N-word, they report that their teachers have never discussed it with them or facilitated a critical discussion about white authors writing it in their books. Despite there being a great need for these conversations, my efforts to diversify the curriculum, remove barriers to success for students of color, or point out racism that's built into our education system have all been stifled and discouraged for years. So here's the hyperdoc that I mentioned earlier, and this will be available to you at this link right up in the top right, bit.ly/Baha'is and racism. So after this, you'll have the opportunity to click around and explore all the information that I won't be able to cover today. The only thing you need to remember about using this document is that every image is a link. Right now, I'm going to click into this image, how is racism described in the Baha'i writings? I grew up in the Baha'i Faith, and I could easily recite quotations like, so powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth. And racism is an affront to human dignity, a cause of hatred and division, a disease that devastates society. I knew that the good and moral truth was that all people, regardless of race, were equal. And all the while, I associated racism with what I had seen on TV, one person being mean to another person because they were Black. I always thought how easy it would be to just talk to these racist people and empathy, and racism would be solved. Now that I've been studying American racism for several years, I continue to learn new ways that it goes far beyond hurtful personal interactions and how pervasive and harmful racism actually is in our society, which is an idea that has been emphasized in the Baha'i writings over and over. So we're going to take a look at some quotations, but before we do, I've included a note on terminology that we will see in some of the passages. Since the time they were written, these words are now considered outdated or offensive. Please keep this in mind when discussing writings about racism. You can click on the graphic to learn more about a variety of racial terms and why they are considered offensive. Additionally, you will see the word Black cited in quotations in lowercase, but today it is more appropriate to capitalize the B when referring to Black people. And if you've noticed, I've been using the word enslaved. This is instead of using the word slave, which is associated more with an object or a tool than a person. Or worse, as some American history textbooks say, workers who were brought over from Africa. The language we use is important in conveying the reality of our racist history. Consider the difference. slave master or slave owner, both titles of esteem and accomplishment, as opposed to enslaver, which points to the subjugation of another person. If you have the HyperDoc open, you'll notice that I'll be skipping some slides in the interest of time today, but like I mentioned before, you will have access to this document so that you can explore all of the information on your own. So how is racism described in the Baha'i writings? In The Advent of Divine Justice, Shoghi Effendi explains that racial prejudice has bitten into the fiber, attacked the whole social structure of American society, and is the most vital and challenging issue confronting the Baha'i community. The National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States implored believers in 1991 to arise without further delay to resolve the fundamental societal problem of this country. And Dr. Robert C. Henderson, a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, explained in 1993, "Our children are at risk. Daily, they are victimized by the perverse and persistent belief that skin color is a measure of human value. All children are our children. Therefore, we cannot sit idly by while growing numbers of innocent ones are tortured by the violence, hunger, poverty, and hopelessness which result from the national subscription to the false doctrine of racial inequality." This message is consistent with writings of Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, Shoghi Effendi, the NSA, the Universal House of Justice. Racism is a scourge in our society that must be eradicated if we are to ever achieve peace. Now, I'm going to open up this second link, which will explore the connections between US racism and the Baha'i writings. So this document is set up a little differently, and as you click through, you will explore 3 different sections. Along the far right, I have included passages from the Baha'i writings that pertain specifically to racism in the United States. In the middle, we'll be focusing on a section of the timeline that I mentioned before, and along the bottom, we have examples of systems in our society and how racist events from history have led to continued injustice today. We've read the passages, we understand how grave a problem racism is for everyone in society, but what does this really mean? And what do we do about it? To answer these questions, we first have to understand systemic racism. Systemic racism is defined on this slide as practices that were once rooted in law and have residual effects throughout history. The example included in the HyperDoc is about redlining, a form of housing discrimination that started in the 1930s. Even though it's now illegal, redlining has left a legacy of disadvantage for Black communities that continues to manifest in systems of housing, wealth, healthcare, and education today. With the understanding that laws and policies like redlining codify and institutionalize racism in our country, we start to recognize that this has been happening since the United States were founded, and the Baha'i writings have addressed this problem explicitly. In 1991, the NSA of the United States said, "From the day it was born, the United States embraced a set of contradictory values. The founding fathers proclaimed their devotion to the highest principles of equality and justice, yet enshrined slavery in the Constitution. They also say the evil consequences of slavery are still visible in this land." This acknowledgement of institutionalized injustice in the way that bigotry is embedded into our foundational documents over 200 years ago and is still a detriment to social progress today, model for how Baha'is should approach racial justice, with the goal of disrupting systems that uphold injustice. Like I said, in the interest of time, I will be skipping some of these quotations, but I encourage you to consider and discuss these passages with your study group. While various writings explain that the diversity in the United States would make it a perfect model for the achievement of world peace, and the Universal House of Justice tells us that it's our responsibility to set an example that society as a whole can follow, They also say that peace is not possible in the short run, and that racial prejudice has transmuted into forms that are multifaceted, less blatant, and more intricate, and thus more intractable. This is due to the fact that racism in America has never gone away. It has simply evolved over time with structural reinforcement. And that is the systemic piece that I want to talk about specifically. On this timeline, so we just have a piece of the timeline that I mentioned that's linked on the main page of the hyperdoc. I have placed major Baha'i events into the historical context of racism in the United States. Several words represent racism in its various forms throughout the centuries, inflicted on Native and Indigenous, Black and African American, Asian and Pacific Islander, Mexican and Chicane people, or other oppressed groups. Some terms that stand out from the timeline: enslavement, pseudoscience, colonialism, massacre, harassment, exclusion, segregation, internment, lynching, discrimination, mass incarceration. As we move down the timeline, the manifestation of racial prejudice adapts depending on the context, as well as the system that upholds it. I'll be focusing on 3 systems today: education, legal and criminal justice system, and white supremacy. For each of these systems, you'll find information in 3 categories. First, what are the examples of racism that were rooted in law? Second, how the residual effects of these laws continue to manifest today. And finally, a passage from the Baha'i writings describing how each system magnifies injustice in our society. Shout out to my educator friends who are tuning in to watch this. You know that I poured my heart into this part, the education part. And without you, I wouldn't be the teacher I am today. I could talk about racism and inequity in the education system for hours, since I've been an educator for almost 15 years. And racial prejudices and practices are built into everything: student populations, curriculum, assessment, achievement, discipline, hiring, teacher retention, social emotional learning outcomes. I could go on, but I've included just a few of the major factors here. Starting with the US history of racism in education, there have been countless attempts to safeguard racial segregation in schools and to ensure Black students received inferior schooling. The Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, made separate but equal schools legal. But even after Brown versus Board of Education mandated integration, Southern states resisted desegregation for several years. For example, in 1957, 3 years after Brown versus Board, Governor Orville Faubus called in the Arkansas National Guard to physically prevent Black children from entering Little Rock Central High School. The residual effects of policies like these still continue to manifest today in phenomena like the academic achievement gap between Black and Brown students and their white and Asian peers, and modern segregation, which is now influenced by wealth and property tax. Standardized tests, including the SAT and advanced placement tests, have a history of bias that continues to exclude or fail students of color at disproportionate rates. The SAT, one of the 2 allowed tests for admission to higher education, was developed by a white supremacist who related so-called scholastic aptitude with race. He believed that race was the reason for the decline in American education and that it would, quote, proceed at an accelerating rate as the racial mixture becomes more and more extensive. What I believe to be the most insidious iteration of racism in schools is disproportionate discipline practices, originating in unconscious bias and resulting in Black students being suspended or expelled at a rate 3 times that of their peers, and being far more likely to be arrested at school, and the darker their skin, the more likely they are to be suspended, especially if they're girls. And despite the gap in enrollment in higher education, students of color bear disproportionate student debt in the United States. These educational injustices are alluded to in the NSA's vision of race unity when they acknowledge that the need for employers to provide diversity and inclusion trainings indicates a glaring deficiency of the entire educational system. and its shortcomings in addressing prejudice. They go on to say that education is the shortest route out of prejudice, yet it is evident that education's major failures include: 1, teaching our nation's history without a critical eye toward racial violence, and 2, refusing to address racial inequities and barriers to student success that have been present for hundreds of years. And this data I included is only for Black students. This doesn't even touch on the issues regarding other student groups, including students with disabilities, LGBTQ+ students, and other racial and socioeconomic groups. Oh, before I leave education, I want to mention an organization that I'm a part of, Teach Plus, with whom I'm a senior policy fellow. We will be publishing a research brief soon that presents the importance of culturally affirming school spaces that actively work against racial injustice. And you'll be able to find that report linked on my website once it's available. According to the theory of the school to prison pipeline, those very students who are victims of disproportionate school discipline continue on to enter the legal and criminal justice system, which has been the focus of the uprisings we've seen this summer. Calls to defund the police can actually find justification in US history, starting, as most injustices do, with the enslavement of African Americans from 1619 to 1865. Early forms of policing included slave patrols, and even after the emancipation of enslaved people, practices such as sharecropping and Jim Crow laws, which exploited Black Americans and legalized racial segregation, respectively, continued to relegate African Americans to a second-class citizenry that needed to be policed to ensure order. A loophole in the 13th Amendment, the constitutional amendment that outlawed slavery, means that today enslavement is still legal as long as it is the punishment for a crime. Thus, mass incarceration and prison labor have become what Michelle Alexander describes in her book as the new Jim Crow. And policies such as stop and frisk and the calculated war on drugs are designed to get as many African Americans behind bars as possible. As an aside, the past few days in California have revealed the brutal collision of 3 national crises. 1, our government relies on the free and cheap labor of thousands of incarcerated people to fight wildfires, of which there have been almost 600 just this week, due largely in part to climate change. But these incarcerated firefighters have been quarantined due to the COVID-19 outbreak in the state prison system. The systemic implications of this history are real and manifold. 1 in 3 Black Americans can expect to be imprisoned at some point in his life. Black people are arrested at 5 times the rate of their white peers, are disproportionately and often wrongfully convicted, and are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police. Due to felony disenfranchisement laws, meaning someone is ineligible to vote if they have been imprisoned, today 2.2 million Black Americans have lost their voting rights. Even though the incarceration problem goes beyond just Black and white, Black people are undoubtedly bearing the brunt of this societal injustice. The Universal House of Justice reminds us that it cannot be denied that any failure or lessening of effort in redressing this problem of racism has its most immediate and negative consequences on the minority. Racism manifests in the legal and criminal justice system just like it does any other system, but Black people have endured the most immediate and negative consequences of this system in particular, through no fault of their own. And we, through no merit of our own, have succeeded thus far without feeling the effects of this injustice. Therefore, it is the responsibility of all non-Black Americans to work to dismantle systems like this. Which brings us to our next system, which is that of white supremacy. White supremacy has been a part of our nation since its inception, when colonizers stole land from the natives, enslaved Africans, and excluded foreigners throughout history. Protections for slavery are written into our Constitution, including benefits for enslavers and the fact that Black Americans were only to be counted as 3/5 of a person in terms of representation. Beyond enslavement, there was over a century of legally mandated segregation and anti-miscegenation laws, which forbade interracial marriage until 1967. It is important to note that though other countries practiced enslavement, the United States was the first to delineate race as a justification for the practice. Thomas Jefferson, an enslaver, and the author of the Declaration of Independence, who espoused that all men are created equal, also argued that the differences between the two races were so deep and so ineradicable that the only way to manage African Americans was to keep them in bondage. He supported this assertion using popular pseudoscience and the erroneous conclusion that there were physical and medical differences between the races, which you can learn more about on the healthcare slide of this presentation. Despite his disturbing and racist ideologies and a lifetime of harm to Black citizens, Jefferson is praised in US history books as a heroic and admirable humanitarian and the father of our nation. White supremacy is thus ingrained in our history, our media, our employment practices, and our education in the United States. Those of us who are not Black, including Iranians, have benefited from a system that values and rewards lighter skin. Therefore, it is our responsibility to dismantle these oppressive systems because, staying silent about these issues means that we are content with an unjust system because we are not being directly affected, which betrays our responsibility as Baha'is. The Universal House of Justice writes, "A community such as this, prospering, but at a comfortable distance from the reality experienced by the masses of humanity, can never hope to serve as a pattern for restructuring the whole of society." If we are advocating for peace, we need to begin the hard work of examining everyday systems. We need to make the choice to stop upholding a racist system by actively fighting against it. Sorry if you can hear my dog, she's just eating her dinner. I am going to navigate back to my hyperdoc and into this document, which explores Abdu'l-Baha's relationship with racism in the United States. And again, I'll be referring to the same timeline that's linked in the main page of the hyperdoc. Our two timelines, US history of racism and Baha'i history, intersect in two places. In 1867, when Baha'u'llah was exiled in Adrianople, the Baha'is of Baghdad petitioned the US Congress for assistance. This gives us an idea of the Universal House of Justice's assertion that the United States' potential to set an example that society as a whole can follow. And then in 1898, Abdu'l-Baha's correspondence and encounter with the first African-American believer began a groundbreaking relationship with African-American Baha'is. During his 1912 visit, at the height of Jim Crow segregation, Abdu'l-Baha exemplified anti-racism, both in his speeches and in his actions. Specifically, Abdu'l-Baha had important relationships with two African-American Baha'is, Robert Turner and Louis Gregory. In 1898, roughly 33 years after all enslaved people were emancipated, African Americans were still being exploited for labor. Enslaved humans were the primary source of wealth in the southern United States, and economically, white people could not let go of the benefits of free labor. Sharecropping began as former enslavers allowed African Americans to work on their land in exchange for profits from their crops. Black codes forced formerly enslaved people to sign annual labor contracts or be jailed for vagrancy, and service positions emerged, like butlers, housekeepers, and maids, the primary representation of Black people in early cinema. It was this proximity to white people that allowed Robert Turner, who was born enslaved and worked as a butler for the Hearst family after emancipation, to discover the Baha'i Faith. After writing letters to Abdu'l-Baha and meeting him on pilgrimage, he was treated with love and affection, a deviation from the treatment he would receive in the United States. Upon Turner's passing, Abdu'l-Baha wrote an important tablet with a revolutionary take on racism, citing that the sinless one was black in color, and like unto the black pupil of the eye, he was a source of shining light. Abdu'l-Baha invokes the pupil of the eye metaphor, which originated with Baha'u'llah, a handful of times, and in each iteration reveals nuance of his approach to racial justice. In one passage he writes, "The pupil is created black, yet it is a source of light. I hope God will make these black ones the glory of the white ones, and as a depository of the light of the love of God." Keep in mind the historical context of Abdu'l-Baha writing to African Americans. Enslavement, which considered black people as subhuman, had only nominally been abolished for about 40 years. And now segregation laws and blackface minstrel shows continue to degrade African Americans and perpetuate social inferiority. Abdu'l-Baha was keenly aware of the horrors of the Jim Crow era when he wrote these words, elevating them above non-black people in the eyes of God. In another iteration, he writes that in this black pupil is seen the reflection of that which is before it, and through it the light of the Spirit shineth forth. Not only does the pupil reflect the reality of racial injustice in American society, but it also acts as a conduit for the love of God. In this way, Abdu'l-Baha's stance on race in America goes beyond personal interactions and places us in the white surrounding the black pupil in a position of responsibility to uplift black people by dismantling the structures of injustice that have disadvantaged black people for hundreds of years. This message is also a challenge to several early American anti-racism efforts that unfortunately fell victim to white saviorism, or the idea that black people need us to save them. And we continue to see this idea in movies, mission trips, books. To tie back to the education piece, one book that is still on several required reading lists throughout the nation is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. And it includes one of the few black characters represented in a standard curriculum, but glorifies Atticus Finch as a white savior. Abdu'l-Baha's approach stands in stark contrast. Black people do not need to be saved, but they need non-black people to use our power and position in selfless service to the faith and to our society to challenge the issues that they are still facing. Another prominent relationship is with Louis Gregory, the first African American to be elected to the national governing body of the Baha'is of the United States and Canada, and the first African American hand of the cause of God. He became a Baha'i in 1909 during a tumultuous time of strict segregation, violence, and lynching. For context, Gregory's mother and grandmother achieved emancipation just 9 years before he was born, and his grandfather was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist terrorist group. In 1912, when Abdu'l-Baha visited Washington, D.C., he insisted that Louis Gregory be the guest of honor at an all-white reception, which was unheard of during Jim Crow segregation. In this way, Abdu'l-Baha embodied this relatively radical approach to race unity and led by example. During Abdu'l-Baha's time in Washington, D.C., racism was at the forefront of his numerous speeches. He spoke at the 4th annual conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, Bethel Literary and Historical Society, and Howard University, all primarily Black institutions. He was named Man of the Month in the NAACP publication, The Crisis, and met W.E.B. Du Bois, famed civil rights leader, author, and co-founder of the NAACP, who wrote that he had great respect for Abdu'l-Baha and for his movement. I want to mention the significance of Abdu'l-Baha's speech at Howard University in particular. Not only was his speech unprecedented in segregated society, both in terms of content and delivery, but he chose to speak at Howard, Louis Gregory's alma mater, and a historically Black university in Washington, D.C. Historically Black colleges and universities were first established as the only opportunity for Black students to obtain higher education during enslavement. Today, HBCUs are an integral part of the Black higher education experience in the United States. There is a ton of information linked here about the culture and the history of HBCUs, their relevance to today, and the impact that they have had on popular culture. In May, Barack and Michelle Obama even broadcast a 2020 commencement address, the Show Me Your Walk HBCU edition. Howard is one of the most prominent of the historically Black universities, and its alumni include Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, California Senator and Vice Presidential candidate Kamala Harris, two of my favorite authors, Toni Morrison and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and actors Taraji P. Henson and Chadwick Boseman, who starred in Marvel's Black Panther. I highly suggest that you watch Dr. Ruha Benjamin's keynote from April 26, 2020 in commemoration of Abdu'l-Baha's visit to Howard University. And it's also interesting to read the April 25th, 1912 news report in the Baltimore Afro-American entitled Baha'i Leader at Howard University. Now that we've explored the intersections of racism in the United States, the Baha'i teachings, and Abdu'l-Baha's example of anti-racism, it's time to determine how we can take action against racial prejudice and systemic racism. Civil rights icon Angela Davis said, "In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist." There is no doubt we live in a racist society, and it is not enough for us to preach kindness and love without taking action against the systems that uphold racism. Similarly, the Universal House of Justice emphasizes that study must be accompanied by action. So this hyperdoc was designed for both. With this resource, you could find a wealth of information linked through each image, and also find helpful guides and action items that you can implement to start working against racist systems. The first step is to determine where we fit into these systems. Where it says over here on the left, where do I fit? Harvard University's Project Implicit offers a variety of short tests to assess unconscious bias, the driving force behind most of the disproportionate discipline, policing, and employment discrimination against African Americans. And please note, we all have implicit biases. If your results indicate that you have implicit bias, you're normal. My results consistently show evidence of implicit bias, which is something that you can read more about in Biased by Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, which is recommended below. There's also a checklist to understand how moving through the world with light skin includes unearned and sometimes unconscious advantages. I've included the New York Times 1619 podcast that is a must listen for anyone trying to unlearn the whitewashed history that we were taught in American schools, as well as an episode of Explained on Netflix that explores the racial wealth gap. Like I said, there are books here that I recommend for further learning on anti-racism, and I've created book study hyperdocs for 2 of these books, which you could find on my website, nadiarazi.com. After determining our positionality, implicit biases, and how we benefit from white supremacist systems, we can move over to the side that reads, "What can I do?" I've included some suggestions for action steps, a link to an additional set of resources specifically designed for educators, where it says try starting here, and some must-see documentaries and TED Talks. Finally, I've included social media accounts to follow, including Dr. Joy DeGruy, author of Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and Dr. Ruha Benjamin, author of Race After Technology, who are both Baha'is. As the Baha'i writings recommend a grassroots approach, one that fosters love, unity, and education, it's important to understand what that means to us and how we will use the writings to inspire us to take action. In this document, you can make your own copy, right here where it says click here to make your own copy, and interact with select quotations and discuss responses among your study groups. For each quotation, there is a space for you to reflect on what each passage means and how we can consider the historical context when the passage was written to inform a deeper understanding. I urge you also to consider how to use each quotation to inspire your own actions against racism. I'd like to close with one final quotation from the Universal House of Justice, which I've included at the bottom of the hyperdoc. Far from the retreat from the crusade into passivity, this approach calls for tireless and sacrificial effort. It is not confined to words, but calls for systematic action and for learning to foster greater capabilities. It is not satisfied with the expression of contempt for injustice or a temporary alleviation that could be swept away in the next generation, but demands nothing less than the profound and lasting transformation of the social order. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions you have if I can. I'd be happy to.
Thank you so much. That was really great. Thank you. I wish this could go on a little bit longer because listening to you is really, I think, a confirming experience. And obviously you've done a lot of study on it. There are some questions coming in and I just wanted to share the first one, if that's okay with you. I just wanted to know a little bit more about what you said earlier about girls with darker skin more likely to be punished than boys with darker skin or with other girls. Could
Okay,
you?
great question. Yes, so the short answer is that they are more likely to be punished than other girls. So to be clear, the subgroup of students that receives the most discipline are Black boys. So there's nobody that is beyond Black boys. They are always at the top of all of the charts. And in fact, I've linked a couple of charts. If you go on the hyperdoc and click on today's date at the top, it'll come up, there'll be an option for you to see a transcript of the speech and also have a list of references. So if you want to go in there, I think that it's called the hidden racism of school discipline in 7 charts. So you'll see a couple of those charts that is where I got all of the citations for the stats that I linked in terms of school discipline. But yes, so Black girls, it kind of goes like this. It has two lines, and the Black boys, though they're above in terms of being disciplined more than Black girls, the Black girls, depending on skin darkness, the slope is much steeper. So the fact that they are being singled out as opposed to their fellow girls at a disproportionate rate. But that being said, Black boys are still being disciplined more than Black girls. Thanks for asking that.
Great. That's good to know and sad to hear. I know that just in the questions and in my questions to you, I will be making mistakes. So I'd like to ask for forgiveness for my ignorance. I would like to ask the next question. What would you say are the individual behaviors that one can take to counter racist behavior now? I'm sure all of us participate in small chats where we hear things from our friends and we don't know how to deal with it. If you could just address that.
Yeah, well, that's basically where it starts, is that if you're hearing, problematic things among your friends or your family, it's harder when it's your family, but when you're hearing these problematic things, to first and foremost address them. And that being said, you don't always have to know what to say. You don't always have to have the right answer, but just to kind of engage that comment and say, why did you say that? Or just pointing out the fact that you think that it is hurtful or it is offensive or in some way. And you don't need, the responsibility is not on you to be able to tell them why it's offensive, or you don't need to know specifically why what they said is wrong. It's our responsibility to say, hey, I didn't like that you said that. And now here's a bunch of stuff online that you can look for yourself and educate yourself, right? So with issues like this, it's impossible to always know what to say. There's not a right answer. And that's why I say that if you hear that in the moment, just address it. And what I always like to do, especially with my students too, is just ask them, why did you say that? And just get them to think about it for a moment. Maybe they don't realize that what they said was hurtful. And if you personally took offense to it, if you're comfortable, you can say, hey, that was hurtful to me. But just to be clear, that it is not the responsibility of Black people or people of color to be the ones explaining to white people why what they said is wrong, right? So it's enough to just say, hey, I didn't like that you said that. Here's a book to read, or why don't you go Google it, right? So I'm totally in favor of doing that. In addition to that, I have on the action section of the HyperDoc included just a list of things that you can do. One of them is what I think a lot of us are already doing, which is facilitating study circles and youth groups, and just reading what the Baha'i writings say, and also reading what all of these race scholars, that some of them that I have mentioned today, say, and thinking about it and talking about it and making it normal to talk about racism, and not kind of shy away from it in a way that makes it seem like it's off limits to talk about. It should be on limits. It should be a conversation that we can all have, because otherwise it's just going to continue to get worse. So I made a list on that taking what can I do side right next to the grassroots approach. So it says amplify Black voices, either if that's in your life or on social media, or however you're able to amplify Black voices, not speaking for them, but amplifying Black voices, discussing and challenging racism with your friends and family and colleagues, which is what you said, so that was good. Facilitating study circles, youth groups, educate yourself and others about implicit bias and systemic racism, donate to causes, working to dismantle oppressive systems, and to choose to unite in the spirit of love. And that answer is kind of drawn from the Baha'i writings as well as my experience. So that's kind of, that list is all me. So that's not specifically, delineated in the writings, but I created that list of kind of action steps based on all of the research that I've done.
Okay, great. So thank you. I just wanted to let everybody know that this fireside will be uploaded to a site called firesidebaha'i.org, and there you will be able to see the hyperlink and you will be able to take advantage of it. Also, we have sent to everyone Nadia's site, which is www.nadiarazi.com. So there you will be able to find the information she's talking about and be able to actually click on each of the hyperlinks.
Mm-hmm. And I'll put in the link to the actual HyperDoc as well, which is bit.ly/Baha'is and racism. So that'll take you to the main page of the HyperDoc.
Great. So the next question is, why do you think Baha'is haven't heard about Dr. Alan Locke? I'm one of them, so I can't really say anything about that. Could you tell us a little bit more about him and about his professorship at Howard University, how he was spoken of by Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi and so on? Could you give us a little bit of background there?
I when I was deciding what to include in the talk, I had to do a lot of editing, and I actually was reading about Alan Locke and decided not to include, and I don't remember why at this point, but I'm not going to be able to answer that question effectively. I would answer the question with another question, which is why we haven't heard of a lot of things, right? A lot of people, a lot of systems, and that's part of what I'm trying to address, is that, we do need to educate ourselves and kind of find out for ourselves all of these things that we haven't been taught, right? So the fact that you're saying, you know, we've never heard of this person is not surprising, because I'm sure that I said a lot of things in my speech that people had never heard of before. So I'm sorry that I can't answer that question effectively. But I do know that there are sources, because I was reading about him in researching for my talk. So I do know that there are a lot of sources online that people can find out on their own. Sorry.
Okay. So the next question, thanks. The next question, you know that I participated in a talk recently. The speaker was also from Iran. She's Canadian, and she called herself a white passing person of color. Mm-hmm. And I thought that that was both sensitive of her as well as maybe slightly insulting. I'm not sure.
Well, okay, so what's your question?
No, because of the color of your skin, my skin, we are here trying to do something, but we've obviously taken advantage of what has been presented to us as people who might pass as white. Right. So what do you think, what advice would you give to white passing people of color in terms of understanding white privilege? Mm-hmm. That's one.
That's a really good question. Oh, keep going.
Okay, and I just wanted to join that with another question that has to do with then how do we attract people of color to our groups, whether there are friendship groups or whether there are Baha'i groups and so on, when they are so much in the minority. So when do they feel bad seeing that almost everybody looks white, even if we are people of color?
Mm-hmm. I really like this question. Whoever asked it, excellent question. So I describe myself the same way, and just a conversation I had with my mom, because she was taken aback that I referred to myself as white passing or white presenting. And I do consider myself a person of color, because I have not, historically, my ancestors have not been in this position of whiteness and colonialism that lead to a lot of the injustices in our country today. So that being said, I think it's really important that if you are referring to yourself, like, I mean, I do refer to myself as a white passing person of color. But that being said, when I do that, I know that I'm not putting myself at the same level as Black people. And there's a reason why. There's a term that you may see online that is BIPOC, or BIPOC, so Black and Indigenous people of color. And that the emergence of that term is because of the fact that not all people of color have experienced the same amount of oppression as Black and Indigenous people of color, right? So that's why a lot of Black people actually have an issue with the term people of color, because it lumps everybody together. And somebody like me, that would consider myself a person of color, but just like you said, has benefited from systems that reward white skin throughout my whole life. That is a very different, that's a very different experience than somebody who's not able to pass has had in society. So I know you had a bunch of questions. I do want to point out that whenever possible, we should be owning our privilege and saying, yes, I am white passing, and I have benefited my whole life from having light skin, and I've been rewarded in certain cases for having light skin. And not trying to kind of lump ourselves in as, oh, we're all people of color, because a lot of times Black and Indigenous people of color will then, just like you said, feel excluded, or feel that not everyone in this group has had the same experiences I have, right? So when I say that it is the responsibility of white passing or white people, including Iranians, I mean that because we're the ones who benefit, we are the ones that have to speak up and dismantle. So a system that disadvantages people is not going to be able, they're not going to listen to the disadvantaged person when they say, hey, this system isn't fair. So it's up to us who have benefited from the system to say, hey, guess what? The system actually isn't fair. Even though I've benefited from it, it's not right. And that's why we need to kind of work to dismantle it. I don't know if I answered your question.
I think you did, and it's good to have an umbrella answer like that, because then other people can ask further questions. And obviously, we're not going to be able to cover absolutely everything.
There's
But
no way.
it's good to be able to admit, you and me, that there are situations in which we have benefited, and every word makes a difference when
Right.
you're in pain. So that kind of thing, it's good to hear. I don't think there's a, oh, did I answer everything or not? Don't worry about that. Okay, so the next one is, why do people fear Black people so much? And well, it continues, are they afraid or jealous of them? And is it because they've been bullied and so on? I think it's kind of a loaded question.
It's a
But
loaded question, but there's an easy answer. There actually is scientific evidence as to why people are so uncomfortable around Black people. And a lot of it is what I discussed in the historical context, that the fact that in the United States, Black people were brought over and thought of as subhuman. They've been thought of as animalistic. They've been thought of as not equal. Even no matter how many times we could say, I think that Black people are equal, we all still have these implicit biases that have been ingrained throughout media, education, interactions, everything that is going to kind of add up in our subconscious mind. And when you see Black person, then there's this unconscious reaction to it, right? And you explain, or whoever asked the question said the word fear, right? So this book that I mentioned is you have to read this book. This is Biased by Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt from the Sparks Center at Stanford University. And this is cutting edge research, all done by an African-American sociologist, Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt. And it's basically the only research that's been done of its kind, and it's all recent, as to why people have these biases and how these biases have played out and affected all these different systems like education, criminal justice, all of the things that I was talking about. So, and you know what, my students always ask too, like we'll be talking about it and we'll say like, you know, they brought them over, they treated them like animals, they needed to make sure that they weren't on equal footing throughout history, right? And they always ask me, but why? And I say, I wish I knew. I can't explain to you why people are white supremacists. I don't understand, and I can't answer that. But books like this, Biased by Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, really do a good job of, and also actually White Fragility, which is written by Robin DiAngelo, who is a white author, but it's still, you should still read it, do a really good job of kind of revealing why people think the way they do and why these biases are ingrained and how the biases are exacerbating racism in our society every day.
okay, great, thank you. There's a long question here. I'm going to just read it out to you. You mentioned the fallacious doctrine of white supremacy and the ongoing legacy of American racism and anti-Blackness that ensnares even immigrants that continue to arrive at its shores.
Mm-hmm.
As an Iranian American and a Baha'i that believes in promoting racial justice and unity, how can we stand out as anti-racists in behavior and action and attract more African Americans to the Baha'i Faith?
Another great question, and I have another great book to recommend to you. I'm sorry, I'm an English teacher, so these books are like what I'm always going to answer. So How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. So Dr. Kendi is one of the I included him on the who to follow. He is one of the leading anti-racist scholars in our time right now, in addition to Ta-Nehisi Coates, who writes Between the World and Me, which is also over here. So to answer questions like that of how to be an anti-racist and how to kind of recognize our biases and things like that, I am not going to try to give you an answer, because these Black authors and scholars have written it perfectly in their books. So I would encourage you to read those books, but then also understand that it's not enough to just read, right? So once you're done with the book, coming back to the hyperdoc and thinking about how to take what we read and how to use it in our own lives. But that being said, I think it's interesting, the part of the question that was about attracting more African Americans to the faith. So can you read that part again to me?
Sure. How can we stand out as anti-racists in behavior and action and attract more African Americans to the Baha'i Faith?
Mm-hmm.
So they're linking the idea of our standing out against racism as a form of showing our transparency as a community, our acceptance, our tolerance as a community. It could be that you could say one does not necessarily follow the other. It's not.
I was going to say, I think that it is kind of two separate questions, right, which is why I think I'm having trouble answering it. And part of the reason for that is, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, go ahead.
I think that part of the reason that I'm having trouble answering it is the part where it's asking me, how do I stand out, or how do I show, how do I, prove that I'm an anti-racist? And I think that that's not the goal. I think that, and we've seen a lot on social media recently all summer of, this performative activism and posting things and trying to, prove like, hey, I'm woke, or I love Black people, or I'm an anti-racist, right? And I think that that's not that shouldn't be our goal, nor should it be our goal to, specifically target and, recruit African Americans to the Baha'i Faith. I think that in our actions and in our like the way that we present ourselves and the way that we interact with people of all races should speak for itself. And I think that if it comes, I've had this conversation where people will ask me, how did you get so, interested in race, or what started this? And I'll say, I grew up in the Baha'i Faith, and that was one of the central tenets of the faith, is this equality of all races and the unity of mankind. And so allowing that to come up naturally. I don't think that it should be our goal to, say to prove our anti-racism. So I think that's why I'm having trouble answering that question.
Okay, and I respect that. I wouldn't worry about that one. I do also agree that our intentions have to be so pure that we're not just trying to become anti-racist in order to attract one ethnicity or another. So I believe that question is a difficult one to
I think it also goes back to what I mentioned during the speech and the idea of white saviorism. And I talked about it quickly. There's a lot more to talk about, but I think that the idea, like I said, it's been in movies, it's been in books, we see it all the time I'm trying to think of if you think about the movie The Blind Side, for example, this white family that goes in and saves this Black boy who without them would have been, doomed to whatever. So I think that idea, we need to, go out and find all the Black people and bring them into the faith because so that is kind of, I think I'm just going to go back to what I said, is that I think that shouldn't be the goal. I think that the goal should be to understand our positionality, to understand how we benefit from systems, and then to really think, who am I and what is my role, and how can I actually work to dismantle these systems and allow our actions to speak for themselves.
Great. Okay, thank you. So changing tack a little bit, we have a question here. Do you think addressing the problem of wealth disparity can over time address the racism issue?
Great question. Great question. And the reason I say that that's a great question is because a lot of conversations that I've had have kind of tried to shift the focus away from race and say, well, it's not really a race issue anymore in our society. It's actually a class issue, right? And what I will answer to that is that it's a race issue. So it's not enough to just say, let me backtrack a little bit. The wealth issue in our society, these extremes of wealth and poverty that are disproportionately affecting different racial groups, is the direct result of the systemic racism that has existed in the United States since slavery. So it's not enough for us to say, let's handle the wealth issue and then we'll get to the race issue, because the wealth issue is so rooted in the race issue, right? They're not two separate things. And what we're seeing in this, these extremes of wealth and poverty is a manifestation of this original problem, which is the subjugation of Black people when they were kidnapped and enslaved in the United States. So without first addressing that, and I don't know how to address it, there have been, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes in The Atlantic an excellent essay, which is called The Case for Reparations. I also linked that in my references because I knew I was going to bring it up because it's awesome. So he writes The Case for Reparations, and I think I also included reparations on one of the slides there's a wealth slide in one of the systems that I didn't get to talk about, but it's in there. And that's a really interesting beginning to the conversation of how we can begin to fix the wrongs that have been affecting communities of color for so long. So I guess the short answer is that it's not enough for us to say, let's just fix wealth, or let's just fix education, or let's just fix the employment problem, because these are all manifestations of the same root issue, which is racism. So that is what we need to start with, and embodying these anti-racist practices, trying to fix the issue of racism first in order to fix the branches of it.
Okay, thank you. I feel like we've shocked a few people by calling ourselves white passing or white presenting, and I've shocked others by calling ourselves people of color, because both Nadia and I, and the speaker I mentioned in the video that I was listening to, come from an Iranian background, where we know in Iran, as in India and many other countries, the lighter the skin, the more popular the girl is. And so I'm sorry if I've offended some of the people who are watching this, but considering ourselves people of color is also a manifestation of our wanting to be, I think, more honest about what's going on, not trying to cover up or trying to be whiter in order to reap more benefits from society. But there's a question here about,
really quick?
Go ahead.
So the reason that I am kind of adamant on calling myself a person of color, but also it is a personal choice. So if you don't consider yourself a person of color, you do not need to call yourself a person of color, so it's up to each person. But the reason that I do so is because of exactly what you said, is this pressure of assimilation in order to be successful in society, not just in the United States, but worldwide. the whiter you are, the whiter you act, the whiter your name sounds, the whiter your hair looks, right? All of these things are associated with professionalism or success. So the fact that Iranians are very comfortable in kind of going along with the idea that, yeah, we're white, is concerning to me, because it is this reflection of oppression. For example, when the natives had their land stolen, the white colonizers and settlers came in and said, you know, they cut their hair, they made them not speak their language anymore, they changed their names. So all of this kind of assimilation and forced whiteness in order to be considered successful is a tenet of the experience of being a person of color. So the fact that in Iranian culture, just like you said, lighter skin, lighter eyes, all of those kinds of things are desired. So therefore, we're kind of taking advantage of the fact that we have light skin in order to, you know, be deemed as successful in the United States. But like I said, if you don't want to call yourself that, that's cool. It's up to you.
So as part of that question, I wonder if you've heard about how Iranians lobbied the US government to be counted as white under the US Census. Had you heard about that?
I had, yes.
Do you want to comment on that?
Not really.
Okay. That's fine. I think that's also another manifestation of our culture, that culturally we were shocked to imagine that we could be considered people of color. And so until recently, I'm pretty sure that all Iranians would just tick on the box that says Caucasian, and that's who we were, and that's the color we identified as. And so that's what I mean when I say that when we start saying people of color and that we are white passing, but we are people of color, it takes a little bit of getting used to for some people.
And I also want to point out that those boxes don't mean anything. So, you know, I've been forced to check boxes that say white in the past because it was the only option. And sometimes even the white box will say, you know, including Middle Eastern and North African. So it's so arbitrary what these kind of lines are of what's considered white and what's not. And the entire classification of race is a social construct to begin with. So we kind of start thinking about, okay, if I want to identify with my ethnicity, which is Iranian, in which case I would be considered a person of color because I have this culture, I have this language, I have customs, I have traditions, and also Middle Easterns have been the victims of oppression and hatred in the United States. So if I'm going to call myself a person of color, forgot what I was going to say. I lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry, I can't help you. I was reading the questions. I'm not going to be able to help you with that.
It's fine. I think I was on a roll, and then just forgot what the last part of the sentence was going to be. So
if it comes back to you, you can hop back on that train. Meanwhile, I wanted to ask you about Black academics and intellectuals like Glenn Loury, John McWhirter, Coleman Hughes, etc., who have more conservative views on how to address the issue of racism. I'm reminded that people like Morgan Freeman will get on shows and say things like, I don't want Black Black month or Black, any kind of Black History Month or year or anything like that, because I think we should stop talking about racism. And when we hear that from a Black person, I find that quite, I don't know if it's constructive or if it's counterintuitive for me in some way. So if you could mention that a little bit.
So I have two things to say about that.
Okay.
One, I totally agree that we shouldn't have Black History Month, but that's not for the same reason. So my students always ask me, well, why aren't we doing anything for Black History Month? And I say, we have Black history every single day in my class, so we don't need a month, right? The idea of spotlighting a month that's saying for this month we care about Black people, I disagree with that. So it's interesting though, because we see, just like you said, a Black person who disagrees with kind of the rest of the idea of Black people, right? And thinking that first of all, Black people are not a monolith, right? There's no way that we can say that all Black people think this, or not all, you know, every single Black person thinks this or whatever. So that's important to understand, is that when we talk about Black people, it often kind of is easy to put everybody in the same group and saying that, you know, oh, the Black people say this. The other thing I will say is that a lot of times we see people weaponizing Black people because they agree with them. So taking a quote, like, I forgot who you said it, but whoever said, oh, we need to stop talking about racism, and saying, look, this Black person agrees with me, so I'm right, right? So all of these kind of strategies and all of these kind of, I don't know, tricks of picking and choosing Black quotations or Black people or ideas in order to kind of support what you're saying is totally the opposite of what we should be doing. One, we should be listening to Black people and knowing that, yeah, they're not all going to agree. And reading things critically, studying, reading multiple sources, and deciding for yourself, is this something that I agree with? Or is this something that, oh, I didn't think about that before? And it's okay to disagree with a Black person about their idea of racism. Everybody is gonna have their own opinion. There's no way to say that, and I know that some politicians have said this in the past, is that, oh, if you don't do this or whatever, then you're not actually Black. So it's a very dangerous road to go down. It's not constructive, and it's designed, I think that the reason that we see it so much in our society is because it's designed to continue widening the gap between white and Black people, to say, look, this one Black person says this, right? So I'll go back to what I said.
But can I just let you know, I was corrected here that Morgan Freeman didn't actually say that. He said what you are saying, which is Black history is American history and shouldn't be relegated to one month. So you're exactly right in terms of this particular question. I misquoted him, and I'm very sorry. And to continue, did you want to continue on that, or did you?
But I forgot what I was going to say again. There's just so much stuff. It's like, there's so much stuff. But what I'll go back to is my answer to the previous question, which was when I said, I don't think that should be our goal, right? And so it's kind of, I made it very clear in my speech today that our goal should be to identify injustice and use our power and position to disrupt it. So to kind of get kind of hung up on these ideas of like, oh, this Black person thinks this, or this other Black person did, you know, kind of like that, I think is not productive, and I think is not what I would focus my energy on, especially given the idea that we know that Black people are not a monolith, and that they are not all going to believe the same thing.
Okay, thanks. So I have a question. This is about the Baha'i point of view again. As Baha'is, how do we incorporate obeying the law, government, politics, and relating that to immigration and illegal immigration, the policies that we find in the countries where we live in? Could you contextualize that in terms of the Baha'i writings that you mentioned so well and you incorporated so deftly in your talk?
Well, first I want to answer it not in the context of the Baha'i writings, if that's okay.
Sure.
And I want to make it very clear that laws are completely arbitrary and are based on whoever. In our society, we're electing people in, right? And a lot of times we've seen that our elected officials are not actually representative of what the people think. And we know, just like I said, there's been a history of unjust laws, like I'll use the anti-miscegenation laws, for example, that Black and white people were not allowed to be married till 1967. So this is a deeper conversation that's not easily answered, but is a conversation that I have often with my students of, when is it okay to not obey a law if it's unjust? And we know that in the past, the only ways to move past these unjust laws is to not follow them. So what I would say is to go and look at all of the quotations from the Baha'i writings that are included in the hyperdoc, and it's been made very clear that the idea of racism and the equality of humankind is not necessarily going to align with the laws of the country. And in most cases, they won't. So I think that what I would focus on is following the Baha'i law, following what these Black scholars and writers are saying. And obviously, we're going to have to follow laws because that's how our society functions. But at the same time, it is our First Amendment right in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to question these laws and to question the way that our society is set up, and not just blindly follow it if it's unjust. In terms of undocumented immigration that you mentioned, it's hard, especially given recently our current administration's stance on undocumented immigration is what a lot of people say is reminiscent to what we've seen in the past in terms of very oppressive of regimes or, you know, administrations. So it's hard. And I'm speaking as an immigrant, as a legal immigrant. What I consider to be the only difference between documentation and not being documented as an immigrant is money. And it's hard for me to engage in the discussion on undocumented citizenship or immigration. I know several people who were not born in the United States and have come over undocumented and, you know, had the opportunity through the California Dream Act or DACA to be successful in the United States despite their parents' choice to, you know, come over here without documentation. So it's a very complicated issue. Like I said, as somebody who and my family have immigrated legally, it costs a lot of money. And if I didn't have the money to be able to, you know, pay to renew my to get a visa, to be sponsored for a visa, to get a green card, to pay for all of the costs associated with citizenship, which I just got 2 years ago, and it costs an unbelievable amount of money. Because I've been through that process, it kind of makes me just think, okay, just because they can't pay for it, that means that they're not, you know, allowed in the United States. So it's hard for me. I am kind of, I've been told I'm a rebel. So it's hard for me to answer, you know, why we should follow laws that I don't agree with, because I don't. So yeah, it's kind of a complicated question and a very complicated answer.
Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to mention a book called Black Like Me that has been recommended by one of your listeners here. Is that on your link?
It's not. I don't think I only included 4 books. So there's plenty of books that could have been on there. So if you have other recommendations, please add them to the chat. That's awesome. Yeah.
Okay, so would you like to make your closing comments? I have a couple of quotes here that I've been asked to read that are part of the Baha'i writings, which I will be happy to read in the end. If you'd like to close yourself as well by reading something, or would you like to have some closing comments? We only have 3 minutes left, so.
I think that I have everything. I think that everything that I've said is cool. Like, I think I put it all on the hyperdoc. I think that Oh, my email. Someone's asking for my email. If you go to my website, nadiarazi.com, all my contact information is on there if you want, including links to the hyperdoc and other hyperdocs that I've made. And I think that's what I'll close with, is just, if you want more information, then you can definitely go to my website and email me if you have questions.
So I'm just going to read some of these texts that were sent to me. Acceptance of the oneness of humanity demands that prejudice, whether racial, religious, or gender related, must be totally eliminated. Misconceptions and prejudices that consider one group of people as superior to another are a major contributor to humanity's present afflictions. Prejudice is a false perception or preconception of others based on ignorance, blinding us to the fact that every person is essentially a spiritual being with unique talents and capacities, a mind rich in gems of inestimable value. Forging strong relationships with people from all walks of life is the antidote to the corrosive disease of prejudice. Search diligently for the truth and make all men your friends. I think I will just close off with that last writing from Abdu'l-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, who always encouraged us, I believe, to make our relationships as honest and as open as possible, and to befriend everybody without the ulterior motive of attracting them to the faith or teaching them necessarily anything in particular, definitely not of saving anybody, but to be friends with everyone in all walks of life. So with that, I would really love to join everybody in this talk to thank you very much, Nadia, for all that you have put into studying this incredible subject. We're at a very crucial time, I think, in the history of man, and hopefully at this juncture we'll be able to make changes, be part of the change, be part of all the solutions that we really need, with a little bit more of education to ourselves, to our groups, our children, our families, and so on. So I really thank you for your initiative, and join everybody in clapping virtually. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.